Hello, this is Mary Jo Fox, and I'd like to share with you information on the second grade comprehension intervention. And what really the gist of that intervention is coaching students on what readers do to comprehend text. Now, the goal of this session is to give our reading coaches, that's you, the information needed to provide that explicit instruction to students on what readers do when they're comprehending text. So the goal of the intervention is to provide that explicit instruction on what readers do to comprehend text. The materials you'll need is text that's already provided in the second grade comprehension intervention document. The time allotment is 15 minutes a day, and the grouping is one-on-one with an adult as the reading coach for the student. Prior to the first session with students, the second grade PLC will need to identify which students will benefit from this intervention. And the students that we recommend are students who are reading at least at a guided reading level 12, but not yet a strong QRI 1. The PLC will also communicate with the parents of the students in the intervention so they know it's taking place. As a building, you'll identify who are the reading coaches, and the PLC will go and match the students to the reading coach and set up a schedule. So the students are going to work daily one-on-one with the reading coach for 15 minutes a day, and then identify for each student if they're going to start with Robbins, that would be if they're more of a level 12 to 15, or if they're going to be starting with Message from Uncle Wilbur, if they're more like a level 16 or a weak QRI 1. You'll also identify the location for the coaching to take place and how the progress is going to be shared between the coach and the classroom teacher. You'll also need to communicate to the student about the intervention and what the goal is of the intervention, and then to train the coaches. Now, what does this look like on day one? Well, the very first thing to do is to share with students the goal, and that is, today I'll share with you how I think before I read, while I'm reading, and after I read, so that I can understand or comprehend what I've read. I then go and I think aloud everything that we're going to do. So what I do is I tell students that I'm going to show them what I do and think about when I'm reading a story, especially when I know that a teacher is going to be asking me questions about what I've read. I share how I look at the pictures in the title to get me to start wonder and get me curious about what I'm going to be reading. And because I know that the teacher is going to be asking questions, I stop while I'm reading and I think about what I've read to make sure it makes sense to me. What I do is I read the story aloud, and then at different places I just pause to think about it. Then I go and I stop to check to see if I've saved it in my brain by retelling it to myself. Then, because I want to be able to answer the questions, I read it one more time so I really can remember it. The next thing I do is I show the students the retelling hand and explain the purpose. The purpose is so then I can check on my reading to see if I really have it in my head. If it's a narrative text, I go and I use the retelling hand, and I start out with my thumb is where I tell who are the characters. My next finger, I go and I tell the setting. The third finger, I go and I tell what the problem of the story is. On my fourth finger, I tell the events, and there are multiple events on that same finger. And then on my little finger, I go and I talk about how was the problem solved? What was the outcome? I then close my hand in a fist and I tell what the story is mainly about. If it's an informational text, I use the fact fingers, and I start by looking at the palm of my hand and I talk about what the topic of the text was. And then on each finger, I try to give one fact from the story. Then I go and I close my hand and I tell what it's mainly about. Again, the purpose of this is to help me to be able to check on my reading to see if I'm able to comprehend what I've read. Now what I do is I go and I model using that first passage, Robbins, and I read it aloud and I stop to go and think about it. So I go and I look at the picture, and as I'm going to look at the picture, I notice there are two birds there, and I noticed that they've got something in their beaks, and it looks like they're building a nest, and it looks like they're doing it in some kind of a tree. I'm wondering maybe why they're doing it, what kind of tree it is, maybe what kind of birds they are. So I get started reading. One morning, the robins are working. Okay, I found out two things, that it takes place in the morning and those birds are robins. They're making a nest. The nest was in an old oak tree. Okay, that's what kind of a tree it is, an oak tree. Mr. Robin found some grass for the nest. Mrs. Robin got mud for the nest. Okay, so that must be what's in their mouth. That must be Mrs. Robin with the mud, and it must be Mr. Robin with the grass. The nest will be made of mud and grass. Soon Mrs. Robin will lay eggs in the nest. The eggs will be blue. Okay, so that's why they need the nest. What will come out of the robin's eggs? I know that. That's going to be robins. So now the next thing I do is I go back to that retelling hand. And I'm going to check on my thinking to see if I remember the story by using that. So I start out with the characters. The characters are Mr. and Mrs. Robin. The setting, okay, that's the time and the place. It's one morning is the time and the place is in the old oak tree. The problem is that they need a nest. The events are that Mr. and Mrs. Robin go and make the nest out of mud and grass. And then the solution is that now they'll have a nest for when Mrs. Robin needs to lay the eggs. I close my fist and the story's mainly about robins building a nest. I think I have it, but I'm going to make sure I reread it just so I have it really in my head. Now, I tell students that although I'm going to read it aloud so I can model it, when they're doing it, they could do it either aloud or silently. One morning, the robins were working. They were making a nest. The nest was in the old oak tree. Mr. Robin found some grass for the nest. Mrs. Robin got mud for the nest. The nest was made of mud and grass. Soon Mrs. Robin will lay the eggs for the nest. The eggs will be blue. What will come out of the robin's eggs? Oh, we know that. That's going to be robins. Now I go and I turn over the text because when I'm going to do it, I can't look back to see the text. And I'm ready to answer the question. The first question is, when were the robins working? Oh, I remember that. That was with the setting. It was one morning. What were the robins making? They were making a nest. Where was the nest? Okay, again, just my setting and the old oak tree. What did they use to make the nest? Okay, they used mud and grass. It was Mrs. Robin had the mud in her mouth, and it was Mr. Robin who had the grass. Yeah, that's it. Why did they make a nest? Oh, so Mrs. Robin would have a nest so she could lay her eggs. Now, that's all that we have for day one. But what I want to do is, again, on day one, talk about, okay, so what are we leaving with? What do we know? So the students, again, can talk about, okay, we have to think aloud while we're reading, and we go and we look at the pictures to see how they're going to help us. We read the story, we stop where we need to as we're reading it. At the end, we check to see if we have it in our head. We save it just like on a computer. And then we can go and we can use the retelling hand to check to see if we've got all of the parts. I then go and I reread it, and then I answer the questions. I want kids to know this because these are the pieces that we're explicitly trying to teach them that they have not picked up on their own. So now we're on to day two. And again, you're going to see these procedures just repeat over and over again. I share the goal with the student that today we're going we'll share how we think before we read, while we read, and after we read, so we can understand or comprehend what we've read. We then talk about that procedure from day one, where we look at the picture, we get ourselves interested in it, we have the things we're wondering about, and then we go and we read it aloud. We then, when we're done reading aloud, we check to see if we have it in our head, we reread it, and then we go and answer questions. Today, though, it gets turned over to the student, and today the student is going to go and read that same story from day one, Robins, but doing the same thing that you had modeled yesterday. After the student has gone through all of the different procedures where they have looked at the pictures, they have read the story, they have gone and stopped, saved it in their head like a computer, and then gone and checked to see with using the retelling hand if they have it. They go and they reread it, and then they answer the questions, and you as the teacher or the coach are the one asking them the questions, but they can't look back. Then you have them tell what they think they did well and what they want to remember for the next day with reading. We are then ready to move on to day 3. On day 3, again, we share that same goal to students. After we're done sharing the goal, then the students are going to go and they're going to go and do that same procedure that we did on day 1 and day 2, but now they're going to do it with a new text. It's text 21 and it's Ann and Andy. They follow exactly that same procedure where they read it, they retell it, they reread it, they answer the questions. When they're done, just like we did on day 2, they share out what they did well and what they want to remember for the next day. We get to day 4. Again, I share that same goal. The students then review the process from day 1, day 2, and day 3. And then they go and they do it with a new text, text 22, Sally's Bath. At the end, they go out and they share what they did well and what they want to remember for the next day. Day 5, and we again follow that same procedure from day 4, and we use that same procedure until we're at the end of the intervention. When we're reading, the things that will change out is if it's informational text, we use the fact fingers instead of the retelling hand. But again, if it's narrative text, we use the retelling hand. We continue with this intervention until the students take the Kansas assessment, and we'll be using the passages in these interventions. If you started with Robins, when the students finish A Dark Night on the Water, then we move to the next group of text, and they're found in your packet where it is after the pink sheet or the next set where it's a piece of cardstock, and we begin with the message from Uncle Wilbur. Again, following the exact same procedure. As a coach, what you are going to be doing is you're going to be recording information from the lessons. So on day 2, because day 1 you did it so you wouldn't be modeling it, you were just modeling it so you wouldn't be recording it, you record the date. Next to Robins, you go and you write down what was the accuracy, how many correct did they get out of the number of questions there. You then go and rate them on their retelling. Was it a plus that they did it well? Was it okay? You'd give them an equal sign. Was it that they didn't well, or sometimes did it or rarely did it, and you'd put a minus. The same piece for if they're self-monitoring, if they're checking on what they're reading to make sure it makes sense and looks right. You then have a space to put your comments. Each student will have their own progress monitoring form, and it just continues all the way through the intervention. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your interest in the second grade comprehension intervention. If you have any questions, please contact Mary Jo Fox at the IRC. Thank you.